This is good. This is anything. Okay, any new issues arise? More questions, conversation, clarification. Any topics that you guys are wrestling with that haven't been treated in the class that you would like addressed and chopped off of the conversation? The sense is you guys know the pieces of the thesis and you're underway with all of them. As you can see from the guests coming in, you're each encountering a different chair style in terms of managing the thesis, but that's built into the process. So nothing that needs to be addressed. Okay, what I want to do today is I want to move into what I'll call some contextual issues around the thesis process. The first thing I want to do is frame what I want to accomplish today, tell you why I'm coming at this. So far, I think for the most part, it's fair to say that most of the chalk talks have been how-to. Most of them have been pretty direct and explanatory in terms of how to proceed with the thesis pretty directly. And now that we've covered that, hopefully in sufficient detail, I want to move into some things that are a few levels removed from the immediacy of the doing of the thesis. And the reason I want to do this is I think it's useful whenever you're involved in something. First of all, you want to have instruction and feedback on the how-to. But then once you have that under control, I think it's useful to look at levels of remove from that, which talk about some general things that influence that, some background behind why you do what you do with the thesis. And so if we repeat one of the little diagrams we had, where we had the introduction, we had the scholarship side, we had the design side, we had the literature review, the topic analysis, we had the precedent study, we had the application, and this was the conclusions. This side was the making side, and this side was the thinking, the scholarship side. So this is the immediate lived experience of the thesis. What I'm going to do now is to take each side of this and look at some issues that surround each side. On the scholarship side, at some point I'm going to talk about research in general, which is the tone and the feel and the basic world within which the thesis floats. So we really haven't talked about research per se, we've talked about research-ish kinds of things as they apply to the thesis. And so at some point down the road I'll talk about research per se. Today I'm going to talk about design theory per se. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about are let's call it the environment within which your application process is floating. And if you recall, we had the final design had multiple influences into it. You had your literature review, you had your precedent study, and you got your topic analysis. And we talked about the topic analysis having both a direct and an indirect component. And I think it's fair to say, too, that we may normally think of the precedent study and the literature review as being largely direct influences on the design. But I think it's probably useful to imagine that these things may have indirect influences too. And if you remember, the direct didn't require any translational work. In other words, it's in Alvaro's sense situation, for example, he's got these sub-solutions which are biomimicry technology configurations, and his job is to figure out how to integrate them into design. There's not any flexing involved there. You may have to bend them and flex them to get them to fit, but there's not any major transformation. Whereas the indirect, remember, that was the more artistic. It was working with metaphor. It was dealing with principles here that weren't having any direct influence on the design, but we wanted them to have at least a flavoring influence on the design. So those are the little sculptural models that some of you are beginning to involve yourself in, like Jerome. So what I want to do today is look at these two different tones, the direct, sort of logical, under control, reasonable flow, which happens in the design process, and the indirect flow, which tends to be more artistic, more intuitive, more visceral, more mysterious, less rational. Because if you trace the lineage back for each one of these mentalities, and they really are different mental gears, you'll find they both have a lore, they both have a history, they both have a lineage, they both have a kind of an unfoldment that goes way, 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 way back. And so it's the way back that I'm going to talk about today. So what I'm going to do is put two lines on the board which represent those two paths. And you'll see at some points along the path, I'm going to take liberties and putting things on each path that maybe are a stretch to put there, but I'm going to put them there because I think they basically belong there because they're within that tone. So let's say we got a line here. I'm going to make it a long because we got a lot of stuff. We'll make that one the direct path. And we'll put one down here, which is the indirect path. And they're both winding up having an influence on this line. So how far back are we going to go? We're going to go back to the Greeks. Thales was the first Greek philosopher who said the world is intelligible and it can be explained. Hesiod was a Greek poet that said the world will never be intelligible. You can study it all you want, you will never figure it out. And the best you can do is ask the muses to visit you and write poems about it. You can already see the two different flavors forming here. This guy is saying we can figure it out, it's logical, we can research it, we can get it to give away the secrets. And this guy is saying it's basically a sort of spiritual, emotional, non-rational sort of process. So you can already feel the energies forming here between these two guys. Now the early Greeks were wrong about what they said the underlying principles were. Thales thought the underlying principle of everything we see is water. You know, and then somebody came along and said, no, it's air, and somebody else says, no, it's fire. It doesn't matter what they said it was. What matters is they claim they can figure it out. And so you can almost think of this as two concentric circles. This guy says if you husk phenomenology and what you can see, the phenomena that we see, we'll eventually arrive at essences that underpin what we see. We can find those things. And this guy says you can husk and husk and husk and husk and husk and get to what we think is the middle. There's nothing there. There is no essence and there is nothing in the center of things. or if it is, you're never going to find it. So this launches these two, these fundamental attitudes. Now what we're going to do is just plot things along this line that are not chronological, but they're thematic. I'm going to put some things up here which are thematic of the direct process, the sort of sciencey process, the reasonable, under control process. And I'm going to plot things down here which are on the out of control side of things, where you let it go, you let it disappear into the dark, something comes out that you have no idea what was going on. So the god here, which is indicative of this, was Apollo. There's two P's in there. British wouldn't like it, not spelling it right. Apollo was the god of sun, medicine, order, cosmos, thinking, that whole camp of things. Music, anything with structure, anything with order, anything with organization. Dionysus was the god of madness, frenzy, wine, drunkenness, out of control. Wild parties, the whole thing. So you see the energy continuing here. Apollo and what Apollo stood for is about a Thales kind of approach to things. Dionysus is sort of on the side of the poets, who says, you can talk about it all you want, but you're not going to figure it out, so let's have a party. So we have the gods beginning to line up. Now we're not going to get into the whole structure of the Greek god system. All we're going to do is hang a couple of them up here. So Apollo is about cosmos. Dionysus is about chaos. So we have these attributes over here, like order, staid, sober, and we have attributes here. I'm going to truncate my list and talk about some things rather than put them up because I want to finish this today. So then at a certain point in history, there's a historian that says you can divide cultures into two groups. You have communities of obedience and conformity. And you have communities of willfulness and rebellion. Continuing the flavor, continuing the sense of things. So if we look at processes, this tends to be deliberative. Meaning you think your way through it. It's logical, it's rational. It's those things. Down here, you have the aleatoric, which has to do with accident and chance. In the aleatoric process, you're willing to allow uncontrolled influences on the process. A good example is experimenting with glazes on pottery. And you try something, you put it in the kiln, you have no idea what's going to happen. You let it happen, whatever it is, you've let go of the process. You turn it over to something else. So this is about thinking. And this is about intuition. So this is about facts. This is about myth and fiction. So this is prosaic. This is poetic. This tends to be about transformation. And remember, transformation is about morphing, which means it's always visible. In other words, I can track the changes. The changes never disappear. Whereas this is about translation. Meaning this is about the leap. It's about synesthesia. These are your metaphor models where you've got some notions or some energies or some words and meanings, and you're trying to leap to a configuration. But you can't track the process unbroken from the word to the model. There's a disappearing there. And anytime you have a disappearing, you're talking about translation. As, for example, going from Russian to Greek, there's a disappearing. If there's not a disappearing, if all I'm doing is taking one of Alvaro's configurations for biomimicry, and I'm just tweaking it and modifying it and bending it to fit, that's a transformation, because I can track the bending. The bending process never disappears into the dark. Anytime something disappears into the dark and comes back out again, you're looking at a translation. And that's within the flow and energy of this whole thing here. So this is about science. This is about art. And there's some quotes which sum this up. I think it was Descartes that said, if you can't reduce something to numbers, you can't say you know anything about it. In other words, it has to be explainable, rational, defendable. You have to be getting underneath it to the causative processes. You have to reduce it to math in order to say you understand the fundamental principles. It's the whole mindset of physics and basically all of science. That's why no matter what a scientific field is, you typically see people deep into it, they're going to talk about math formulas, because reality ultimately winds up being mathematical to the scientist. And it fits Protagoras, he was another one back here who said, God thinks and makes the world of numbers. Numbers was the mind of God. Well, that fits this whole thing. If you can't reduce it to numbers, you can't say you know anything about it. Picasso says, art is the lie that tells a truer truth. And so he doesn't care about fact. He cares about useful myth. He cares about the intuitive leaps. He cares about artistic gestures that he can't really explain, but if you sit in front of it, you glean some truer truth about life, about you, about what the nature of art is, or what it happens to be. And so those quotes, I think, do a good job of summing up the tone of each of these paths. So the energy of direct application, when you've got some findings and some menus and some libraries and kits and parts that have bubbled up out of your analysis, you're in this flow. You're in the kind of direct line of reason, things under control, very easily traceable uses and applications of things. It's this whole tone and mindset. When you're looking at aspects of your thesis that have to do with anything artistic, have to do with anything that you can't maybe immediately explain because it's come from some place that's not about words. You're doing little study models and you're not sure why it takes that form. All you know is you were thinking this thought, this word, and that form came up. There's no direct connection between word and form. That's what basically synesthesia is. The question of what color is 5. You can't get to a color from 5, and yet you have to answer the question. What form is this word? It's the same kind of question as what color is 5. That's a synesthesia question. So that's this whole line of feeling tone, of approach, of commitment to a way of working. Some of you have theses that are largely indirect, and you're working very high percentage on the autistic side. Some of you are working very strongly on the direct side. Some of you have somewhat of a balance between these things.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I was looking at perspectives, and they had this whole thing about how you do a perspective. If you're on the ground plane, that means you're kind of in the space, or then there's this disconnection if it's above.
Mm-hmm.
So
and you got the
yeah,
angel's worldview.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to do with both of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is a parallel. So the applicability of what's on the board, either both of these lines or one or the other, to me fits in your thesis thinking somehow as sort of a backdrop. I don't think of this as directly applicable to you living thesis, but I find anything having to do with background, backdrop, underpinning, the lineage of things and how they got to be where they are and what they are. It's useful to kind of have that behind me, sort of like a tailwind, because it helps me, I guess, better navigate the immediacy of the task at hand. I've got these tailwinds behind me when I'm working on direct applications or indirect applications. And I would bet that, if we went around the table, which we don't need to do, each of you could point to aspects of your thesis that tend to be here. They're not arguable, they're just sort of logical and defendable. There aren't gaps in the flow of the logic. There's a string of ideas that are leading to a kind of inevitability to the application. Explainable, defendable, traceable, and other things you're going to wind up with propositions like little metaphor sponsors that it's just sort of a visceral reaction. When Jerome puts his metaphor models on the board, on the table, and he says, this was the word I was thinking about, we can look at them and see whether the energy seems to fit or not. Or whether it looks like his sense of what the form should be is radically different from everybody else's. And since metaphor is so a part of this, it's not the only way you can look at translational processes, but metaphor does tend to be a major mode to get from something that starts as verbal or written and trying to get it to be art. Then I'll say a couple of other things about metaphors. Metaphor has to do with displacement. And the way you manage the displacement has a lot to do with the usefulness that the metaphor winds up having in the process. So what do I mean by that? You have a situation here which is real, and you have a metaphor which is going to be a tool to help you somehow do that better. For example, if I'm looking to design a library, and I'm searching for a metaphor that will help me find a new angle onto thinking about the library. So I don't just do a standard library. I want to think about the library in a new way. So metaphor is going to create a displacement. It's going to throw me off balance in a creative way. What you wind up realizing is the relationship between the metaphor and the situation you're applying it to. The fruitfulness of it has a lot to do with how close the metaphor is to the situation or how distant it is. For example, if the metaphor maps directly onto the situation, there's not that much displacement. If I saw the library as a bookstore, well, a bookstore is sort of like a library. There's not much displacement there. The metaphor doesn't throw me out of the world of the library that much. So that would be an example of too close a match. There's not any friction, there's not any electricity, there aren't any sparks that fly. There has to be more displacement there. In other words, the metaphor has to be more different than the situation. Bookstore's too close to library. I can't get much out of the bookstore. If I design the library as a bookstore, it's going to still look sort of like a library because the library sort of is a bookstore. The opposite is true too. If it's too distant, if the metaphor is so radically removed and I have a radical displacement here, I'm also going to have trouble finding usefulness from the metaphor. Library as the planet Jupiter. Well, I'm not sure I can get much out of the planet Jupiter. Maybe I can if I sit down and think about it. But that's pretty remote. That'd be a good example of radical displacement. So I'm looking for enough displacement so that there's still tension, but not so little displacement that there is no tension between the metaphor and the situation. So if any of you are going to wind up working with metaphor, you're going to want to try to find metaphors that are the right displacements in the right displacement situation from the project situation, so you can get some tension and some sparks to fly. Not so close that no sparks fly, and not so far away that the sparks don't land anywhere. So that gets at the skill of mining for metaphors and what metaphors you use. And that'll have something to do, again, continuing with Jerome, because I know this process. It's going to turn out that certain words that pop out of him will wind up generating metaphors, some of which may be too distant from the situation, some of which may be too cozy to the situation. We're going to be interested in the ones that have some creative tension between the situation and its models, so that we can conceive his Center for Sustainable Living in a new way. What I want to do later on, I know we're running out of windows in the semester, but I want to do something similar for research, so that this is kind of a backed off long view of the making process with these two flavors. On the design side and the design flow side of the thesis. The analysis side would be looking at research per se, and some issues on research. And with those two background things treated, I think it would be a nice addition to the other things we've addressed that are more direct applications to the making of the thesis. These things would be more contextual, sort of the larger theoretical environments within which the thesis flows. So, anybody got questions about any of this? Is this too weird? Did you guys try this like that? We really can't say that this is theory and that that's not theory, because there can be theories here. The philosophers, for example, Philosophies here would be positivism. The philosophers would be the English empiricism, rationalism. You find out how the world works by looking at it carefully. So Hume and Locke and Berkeley and Bacon, all those guys would be in this camp. They're saying we can figure it out and we're going to propose the way it is. Down here, you have artists and poets. And you also tend to have certain philosophical branches that say you will not figure out how the world works. You can only address how you're living in it. So these are the existentialists and phenomenologists. People like Schopenhauer and Sartre and Nietzsche and Derrida, the deconstructivists are down here. So since we can't figure the world out, how shall we live today? That's the question. What's a well-lived life, even though we don't know how the world works? That's another layer here. It's the philosophers and the philosophies that ride on these two modalities. Okay, so if there are no questions, we'll go ahead and knock off for today, and we'll hear you two guys present on Monday, and we'll see Arlene